Hello and welcome to the BSc on Social Sciences Taster Lecture. My name is Dr. Kate Bradley. I'm going to be talking to you about sorting society out, poverty and inequality. So I've chosen the theme of poverty and inequality because this is a theme that cuts across the different disciplines that we study on the BSc Social Sciences. This programme has got a lot of sociology and psychology in it, but we also draw upon social policy, criminology and social history. Poverty and inequality, as we'll see, is something that it can be very important to look at from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. And so through today, we'll have an understanding of how we can find out more about poverty and inequality through thinking about how different disciplines might approach it. At various points in this recording, I might ask you to write something down. You can pause the I will leave a bit of a gap, but you can also pause the recording so you've got time to kind of write things down. I will address some of those things as I go along, and others we might want to talk about at other points in the virtual open day. So to the content. Social stratification is a central idea in sociology and a range of other social science disciplines. And it's the way in which we look at differences between people in terms of wealth, status, occupation, income, power, or anything any way in which we can measure differences between people. And because we're ranking people and looking at the relative differences between them, social stratification is a means of exposing inequalities between people. Now, in a purely mathematical sense, what is inequality? Inequality is something being greater than or less than something else. But it has, in terms of society, it's not simply a case of somebody having more of X than someone else, or someone has more of Y. It's thinking about what the impacts of those kind of inequalities are. Inequality is not always experienced in the same way. For example, think about social stratification and thinking about wealth. Wealth can be experienced very differently depending on your race, ethnicity, and your gender, for example, also your age. So again, those kind of factors will shape how you experience inequalities, how people treat you, for example. This is a concept that we also studied in the program called intersectionality, for example. Inequality can be experienced in different ways, and this might depend on the overall mix of what you have. For example, someone who has a low income but is very well connected in terms of their social standing is likely to have a very different experience of that low income in comparison to somebody who hasn't got those connections to call upon. And as I suggested, the way in which we appear to others can shape how we experience that inequality as well, in terms of how others treat us, and then also how we feel about ourselves and the way in which we think about the opportunities open to us. And a key question for us, also as social scientists, is thinking about how does inequality replicate itself? So in other words, why don't these inequalities go away? What is it about our social structures, so our institutions, our kind of cultural assumptions, that keeps this going? And what interventions can we make at national, international, local, individual level to change things? How can we challenge those, and what kind of difference will that make? So I want to give you the paradox of poverty in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the 6th largest economy in the world as of 2019, measured by the International Monetary Fund. 2018, Britain was the 5th largest economy. Yet, nonetheless, Britain remains one of the more unequal nations. So let's just have a look at, this is income inequality in 2017. You will notice that Britain is the red country at 0.36. And this is something called the Gini coefficient, which measures the level of inequality between the richest and the poorest in a country. So 0 means that everybody, the closer the number is to 0, everybody has exactly the same thing. The closer the number to 1 is, the more unequal a country. Now, you will notice that whilst Britain has got a Gini coefficient of 0.36, it is towards the more unequal end of the scale. And so you will notice that countries that in 2017 were more unequal than Britain are Lithuania, the United States, Turkey, Chile, Costa Rica and South Africa. And at the other end, going towards the more equal picture, we've got Israel, Latvia, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Estonia, Canada, the Netherlands, Korea, France, Poland, Sweden, Austria, Norway, Belgium, Finland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic and Slovenia. So, and of course, these are, so we get a sense of Britain being towards very much towards the unequal side in comparison to kind of other countries. So again, so we have a rich country, but also an unequal country. And it's important to kind of think about the extent to which, how do we see this? How do we know that there are people, that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people in the United Kingdom? Well, one way of understanding this is thinking about the incomes that households have, or individuals. Obviously, households can be individuals or households can be families. And thinking about where we decide where the poverty line might be in the United Kingdom. Now, the poverty line is something that researchers from Charles Booth and Seaborn Rowntree in the 19th century have been trying to find ever since, and there are major debates about where this line might be. For example, thinking about Amartya Sen and Peter Townsend arguing about this. But a measure that is used today is looking at what the median income is and then what 60% of that income is. And that gives us a rough kind of poverty line in the United Kingdom. So I'd just like you to, for a moment, write down what you think the median salary in the United Kingdom in 2019 was. Okay, so if you've written something down now, the answer, according to the Office of the National Statistics, was £29,400. So that was the average income in 2019. Now, what would 60% of that be? That would give us 18,375. Now, a question for you to think about is, these are household incomes, not necessarily individual incomes. So I would like you to think about the extent to which this sounds like it's a lot of money or not a lot of money, particularly if you have more than one adult contributing to that income. And if we can also see, going ahead another couple of slides, how this kind of fits. So again, this is looking at slightly different figures for 2016-17, but it's a really nice kind of visualization from the Office of National Statistics about what we might mean by this. And if you look at, so this is looking at the equivalised disposable income, so what families have left to spend and how many thousands of households there are. And you can see, so we're looking at the median and the mean equivalised disposable income. So those kind of two dots, that's roughly where the middle is. But you will notice that, like looking at the bars, there are far more people below that line than there are above. So this is what I say about how wealth is relatively concentrated in the hands of a few people. And whilst there's been some kind of change, so here the median was 27,310 in kind of 2017, and it is in 2019 29,400. We're not talking huge shifts here, but again we can see this is a very similar kind of pattern, so that the middle is roughly around kind of £30,000 in terms of whether that's disposable income or household income, or disposable or kind of gross income, if you will, is what people have left to spend, and it's perhaps less than we might think. So if we're trying to understand this, it's important to kind of think about the different ways in which disciplines might approach this. Again, what economics researchers might come up with, economists, what approaches they might take, how we might approach it through politics, through social policy, sociology, criminology, social history and geography. And we all kind of, I suppose these disciplines are interested in different things. The economists would be very interested in the money that comes into households. I suppose crossing politics and social policy might be kind of thinking about the questions about how do we lift people out of poverty, how do we incentivize people into work, those kind of questions. Sociologists might be interested in the experiences of this or the perpetuation of inequalities. Criminologists might be interested in terms of poverty, in terms of crime. Social historians might be interested in change over time, and geographers in terms of questions about, for example, like the urban environment and how it shapes these things. So different ways in which we can approach this. And there are different ways in which we can see the impacts of poverty in terms of thinking about how it impacts on education, on health, on communities, and on policing and community safety. And this is what we're going to start thinking about now. So I'd like you to have a little think about how you see poverty impacting on society in the context of the United Kingdom. So 2 parts of this. I would like you to look at choose one of the following: health, education, communities and policing. And think about how do you think poverty impacts upon one of those. Okay, just choose one and think about what are the impacts. And the second part, I'd like you to think about one of the following disciplines and how you think they might help us understand poverty or think of solutions. And so the disciplines are sociology, psychology, criminology, and social history and geography. You can merge those 2 together. So think of poverty impacting on one of those, and then think about how one of those disciplines can help you understand the impact of poverty on health, education, policing, etc. So feel free to pause the video. I will now, when you're ready, let it run, and I will kind of talk through this exercise in the next slide. So I've got here an infographic from the Child Poverty Action Group, and I like this infographic because it pulls together a lot of the things that we thought about in terms of how poverty can impact on various things. So this infographic talks about how poverty feels to children. So we can get things like talking about how they worry about their parents, unhappy, frustrated, feeling anxious, a few opportunities, feel worthless, hopeless, social insecurity. Thinking about positive things, children's kind of aspirations, their hopes and dreams, their resilience, but also factors in education in terms of like how what kind of how education can help them, whether they feel bullied or judged at school, the extent to which teachers understand them, and their ability to participate in things like school trips. It might also be thinking about their housing, for example, so insecure, overcrowded homes, where there's space to kind of play or to do homework. And again, thinking about some of the, I suppose, kind of interactions with other children, things like whether you feel like excluded from activities, constrained, conflicted, kind of embarrassed about the situation you are in. And I've chosen this because it pulls together a lot of those things. So again, thinking about how poverty might impact on education. Again, we can see this here, that children may feel that they can't participate in things, that they are that perhaps teachers don't understand, and there's a lot of kind of arguing about, why can't you do this? Why don't you have the right equipment? And again, that might create other issues, for example, such as bullying by other children, or a feeling that you can't participate. And this is one of those areas in which we might, for example, we could approach this through a sociological perspective, in which case we might think about the way in which they expect, focus on kind of some of the cultural expectations of teachers, what the draw upon the sociology of education, like whether education is inclusive or whether it is exclusive, and how it might be and I suppose if we start getting into social policy here, we could think about what we could bring in to try and what interventions there could be for supporting teachers to kind of for them to either directly help children in their schools, but also to think about how they approach their teaching, what kind of assumptions they make about what resources children have at home, for example. Psychologically, we could think about the impact of how children, feel about not having the right equipment to study at school, for example, and how that might manifest in other ways. For example, I mean, that could be very much their fear about school, for example, but it could relate to anxieties perhaps about telling your parents about what is happening, because you don't want to burden them with additional problems. And it could also be thinking about, in terms of psychology, how it might impact on people's hopes for the future, what they think that they can do, what their potential might be. We could also think about this sociologically as well, again thinking about what our expectations might be for children and young people from particular backgrounds, and how we can challenge that. We can also think about, and again this perhaps might bring us into thinking about crime, for example, criminology, in terms of thinking about, well, how do we get people to feel that they are part of society and that they have a value, and to think about their impact on others, for example. So again, that's where we might find chronological perspectives important and useful. In terms of geography and social history, well, we could think about these in terms of thinking about things over the longer term. So what are the impacts, for example, of, say, the rebuilding of houses after the Second World War, or the bomb damage? What, those kind of assumptions made in the 1950s, what kind of impact are they having in the 2020s, for example? How have things changed over time? What kind of longitudinal kind of impacts are there? What can we learn from what's gone before? What has changed? And thinking in terms of space and place, again, thinking about the environments that people are in, the way in which people experience space, the quality of the built environment, your feeling of being safe. So just in kind of like pulling through some of these ideas about how we might experience how poverty is experienced and how we might tackle it through different disciplines. The disciplines can help us to focus on a particular area and explore things, but it's often quite useful to think about what other perspectives can bring. So we could look at, for example, again, thinking about if we're wanting to think about, say, the sociology of education and how children experiencing poverty can get through the system. It's important to know also about the psychological side of it as well, which could be thinking about people's emotions, but also thinking about how they psychologically manage their world as well. So we can get something about the complexity of this. Now, we can look at economically at the experience of poverty. We can spend a lot of time trying to measure which families are in poverty and which are not. But if we combine that with other perspectives, sociological, the psychological, from social policy, from criminological, from historical, geographical, we can start getting at some of the complexities of experience and start thinking about what positive solutions there might be. So, what have we found in this short recording today? Poverty matters because it impacts on everyone, and it has an impact on the economy, the amount of money in the system, people's capacity to go and buy, to consume, to spend money, but also to people's well-being. But understanding poverty, or for that matter, any social issue, whilst we can understand it from one disciplinary perspective, if we start looking at what other perspectives are available, what other disciplines are there, we can start getting different insights into them. We can get further into those problems, because social problems are not simple to solve. They kind of tie in with lots of different angles. Think about my example about we can just look at people's incomes, but we need to know what that feels like. We need to know what assumptions people make, and then we can start, we're in a better position to start thinking about how we might solve them. And it also reminds us of the importance of seeing the bigger picture, that we kind of look not just at kind of what research we might have, for example, on incomes, but also thinking, it's not just in terms of academic sense, but the fact that these are very much real world experiences. And if we can see that bigger picture, see the rich detail and the bigger picture, this is really important to us in trying to tackle some of the big questions we have in society. Thank you.